Much better trained and equipped, Japan's armies drove the Chinese out of Korea, then pushed on into Manchuria. Japan had modernized while China had not. It was a brutal difference.
Something happened to the Japanese mind in the course of this Sino-Japanese war. For centuries, Japan had looked up to China. It was the mother civilization. It was Rome and Greece combined. The Chinese had given Japan their culture, their art, their language, their literature. They respected them tremendously. But now, here they were, coming to grips with a Chinese enemy, and the enemy was weak. And they began to look on the Chinese with contempt as figures for fun or ridicule. They'd call them Changoro, Changchang, the equivalent of chinks. And suddenly, this great respect they'd had for China's age-old culture just dissolved.
The treaty which ended the war was a humiliation for China. Japan received the island of Taiwan, territory in Manchuria, and the same trading rights in China accorded the Western powers.
This was the era of imperialism, and so people thought that if Japan did not become an imperialist nation, she could not become strong and stand up to Russia or Great Britain, that she would lose her independence.
Everywhere Japan looked, the Western powers continued to flex their muscles. In colonial factories, the French tried to milk profits from cheap Vietnamese labor. And the British, French, Russians, and Americans continued to treat China as their Asian playground. China's empire was crumbling, and its neighbors moved to pick up the pieces. Russia took control of Manchuria. Japan dominated Korea. Suddenly, the largest Western nation and Asia's new military power were on the brink of territorial conflict. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack and crippled the Russian fleet. 2 days later, Japan declared war. Russia thought it would crush Japan, but Japan had spent the last 10 years mobilizing for this conflict. Marching into Manchuria to confront the Russians, Japan's army was confident, disciplined, and well-armed. Across the barren landscape, Japan threw wave after wave of troops against the Russian machine guns. Despite horrendous casualties, the Japanese were winning the war.
The Russo-Japanese War was the first time that Japan fought with a non-Asian nation. So the Japanese thought, if we lose this war, then all of the successes of the Meiji Restoration will have been for naught. About 1 million Japanese soldiers went to war. And when you look at the diaries they kept and the letters they sent home from China and Manchuria, you can see that they thought of this as their own war, and they were fighting it for themselves as well as for Japan.
When Japan was victorious, people in Tokyo danced in the streets. Japan's victory over Russia was the culmination of the Meiji modernization.
Japan has become now an imperialist in Asia, following the Western mold. As Japan does this, the West sits up and takes notice, not only the West. When Japan won the war against Russia, other Asian countries said, how about that? An Asian power has beaten Mother Russia. There's wonderful materials even from peasants in Vietnam who said, this is an amazing phenomenon that a Western power has been beaten by an Asian power.
Japan's victory was an inspiration to nationalists throughout Asia, from Gandhi in India to the Chinese revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen. He made Tokyo his base of operations while he planned the overthrow of the Chinese government.
At the time, these people trusted Japan and relied on her and considered Japan to be their leader as a nation. But in contrast to that, the Japanese, after defeating the Russians, became very arrogant. And the Japanese decided that they were going to become the rulers of Asia. And they turned around and they began to invade the continent. So all these leaders from the other Asian nations who had looked to Japan for inspiration were very disillusioned. And of course, the result of this was the Second World War. So in that sense, the Russo-Japanese War was truly a turning point.
Even Fukuzawa, who once urged Pan-Asian unity, now sounded like an imperialist himself.
We cannot wait for neighbor countries to become civilized to make Asia progress. We would do better to treat China and Korea in the same way as do Western nations.
The Portsmouth Treaty made Korea a Japanese protectorate. When Ito, Japan's first prime minister, installed himself as the first Japanese resident general, the Koreans rebelled. The Japanese responded by burning villages and killing over 12,000 Koreans. Ito replaced Korea's king with his young son, who was far more susceptible to Japanese influence. In fact, if not in name, Korea was now a Japanese colony. In contemporary South Korea, just 2 hours south of Seoul, lies Independence Hall. Built by the South Korean government, it is a monument to Korea's attempts to be free. Inside, an entire building is devoted to depicting the brutality of Japan's domination of Korea. Day after day, families file by to be reminded of Japan's efforts to wipe out Korean culture and replace it with its own.
Japan really ends up in loco imperialis, in place of the imperial powers, causing nationalism, directed against its own depredation, its own predatory imperialism. So Asia has always been ambivalent toward Japan, proud and angry, and that remains today.